Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. My name is Nick Messmer, one of the co-hosts of the podcast, and this is a bonus episode in our series on lexical semantics. When Kevin and I recorded the final episode for this series, it ended up being way too long, but we thought all the content was good, so we decided to break it up into 2 episodes. In this episode, we talk about the importance of data when doing lexical semantics, as well as common fallacies and objections. And in our next episode, we'll wrap up the series by looking at actual examples from Biblical Hebrew. I hope you enjoyed the episode. So in the last episode, we started off with just some discussion, kind of summarizing and synthesizing some of the theory and stuff like that we talked about. We talked about how important it is to have clarity on what your objective is in doing lexical semantics. Talked about kind of the 2 key components of that being identifying a lexical meaning and then identifying contextual meanings. And then we also talked about the importance of kind of using all the tools that we have at our disposal. Not just looking at contextual domains and things like that, but also looking at syntax and word classes and things like that. And so just to kick us off today, I wanted to talk about one other really key element in doing lexical semantics, which is the data. It might seem obvious that data is really important when doing lexical semantics, but I think it's worth talking about because I think it's a little bit more slippery of a thing than we often like to think. So, Kevin, I was just wanting you to kick us off with talking about some of the problems we run into with the data.
Yeah, so I think with Hebrew especially, this problem is much more acute, just because the amount of data we have is just minuscule compared to what would be ideal. So, as an example, I was reading a book on nominalizations in English, and in that book they used a corpus of 40 to 50 million words, and they said in the introduction, okay, well, just because we have this corpus of 40 to 50 million words, doesn't mean that we can conclude when we don't see something in the data that is ungrammatical or doesn't exist, right? So they're saying, well, the argument from silence doesn't really apply because we only have, 40 to 50 million words that we're working with here. And, some sort of construction could still be grammatical outside of our corpus. If you compare that to Hebrew, right, we have 419,687 words, and that's just a number I got offline. So, right, it could be, a handful more or less than that. But that's 1% of the corpus, that was being used in this other study, in a modern linguistics, corpus study. And, combine that with the fact that the Hebrew Bible corpus, spans hundreds of years, right? So, if the person using the, English corpus, every single text was like hand curated and, probably within a 10 to 15 year period, right? We're talking about, imagine including in your corpus Shakespeare, as well as modern English. I mean, it's probably not as drastic of a change. I mean, the Hebrew within the Bible doesn't change as much as Shakespeare to today, but it does change, right? And you see significant differences between, like archaic Hebrew, where you have in several passages, versus late biblical Hebrew. And so then compound that with like differences in dialect, variations in where the speaker is coming from, as far as like his provenance, and so the problem with doing corpus studies in Hebrew is just we can really conclude nothing if we don't see something that we might have thought was there.
Right. So practically, there's a couple issues you run into. One is, if you're doing a study on a particular word and you don't find any occurrence of that word meaning a particular thing, that like the more limited your data, the less firm of a conclusion you can draw that the word can't mean that,
Right,
because
exactly.
it might mean that if you had a larger corpus you're working with. And then the other thing you bring up is, kind of in any particular analysis, what counts as data, or which data is weighed more heavily. And we saw that come up in some of the discussions. Nijay talked about the concentric circles in terms of which data was more relevant to what he was looking at. And it comes all the way down to like within the Bible itself. Like, if you're studying how Paul uses a word, is the data in the Gospels just as important as it? They might use the word differently. So definitely slippery in that sense as well.
Yeah, and just to point out that people, I see these kinds of arguments made in commentaries all the time. So they'll say something like, "Oh, well, this construction is never found, therefore," or the word never means this, and therefore it can't, or whatever. And the assumption is, again, that not finding whatever construction or meaning is relevant, and it's really not, right? I mean, that's the bottom line, is that you don't have the kind of data in Hebrew to make those kinds of arguments. It doesn't mean that we can't make other kinds of arguments, right, for what words mean in Hebrew. I mean, I think you can develop a pretty decent methodology on how to go about analyzing words, and we'll touch on that later. But that's not a sound methodology,
right? And one other thing, you can kind of make mistakes in both directions. You can weigh data that's maybe on one of those outer concentric circles too heavily, like it's too late or too early or in a different corpus or something. But you can also make the mistake of not looking at enough data. And I think that's a mistake we can make very easily doing specifically biblical studies work, is just looking at the New Testament, and not looking at occurrences in other Greek literature.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and that is true as well to some extent of the Old Testament with the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have to look at every single scrap of data you can get in Hebrew because it's just not there.
Yeah, one other issue I think we can run into when it comes to data is even those of us who study Greek and Hebrew often are getting mediated access to the data, looking at lexicons and commentaries. Those are good things, but there's even a lot of discussion. I hear about this, like, encouraging people to go to the primary sources first before they consult lexicons and commentaries and things like that. But I still think it's an issue of people having a hard time being able to work with the data well enough to not have to rely so much on lexicons and commentaries. So yeah, what are some issues you think we run into there?
Yeah, I think part of it is, well, like you said, part of it is just that we don't know the languages enough or well enough to really grapple with the data. So, if you're not comfortable reading the text, by itself as a text, then it's very hard, if you're trying to figure out what a Hebrew word means, like it's very hard, to not go to the lexicon first and go to the data first. So you have to, be a fluent reader really in order to really do that kind of work well and efficiently. The other thing is I think we do kind of place this I don't want to say too heavy of an emphasis on lexicons and commentaries. I mean, I think they are important, but what we don't realize is that these are written by people, right? And people that may have struggled with Hebrew, right? May have I mean, they are trying to grapple with the same kinds of questions that we are, right? And so I think that's an important point, right? It's something that you learn as a scholar, like, oh, okay, like these sorts of, these scholarly works are, yeah, they're just written by people that may be right and may be wrong, right? And I think that's for us, when we go to the lexicon, we often view that, oh, this is the meaning of the word, when in reality, that's just an analysis of the meaning of the word, right? And it's so easy to kind of slip into this this thing where we view the lexicon or commentaries as the authority, when in reality, the data is the authority, right? And if you can back it up with data, it doesn't matter what the lexicons and commentaries say. That's, data has to rule, especially in lexical semantics, how we treat words and how we define them.
Yeah. And there's a humility that is good that comes with, not assuming that you can necessarily do a better job than whoever wrote the lexicon, but like you said, data rules. And so, if you're looking at the data and finding something that, is a little different than the lexicon, then that's a good thing. Your comment about just not being comfortable enough with the text. I just remember, in my graduate studies, I would be doing a word study or something, and so I'd be looking, at material outside the New Testament, for example, of uses of the word, but it's I couldn't read that material, so then I would be reading a translation of that material and then making conclusions about how the word was used. But of course that translation itself is an interpretation of the text, and so not
to mention, you often will just read a sentence,
right, exactly.
You're not reading the whole work,
right,
right, and then saying, oh, that's a very odd use of that word in this larger context of the entire work, right, reading it in the original, right, which is a totally different, thing than picking out a particular word in a specific context that you don't really know, right, and then reading a translation of it and calling that a word study. It's just different.
Yeah, and that goes back to a big discussion we had on a previous series, our biblical language pedagogy series, where we talked about the importance of reading fluency, and that being one of the benefits of taking a more living language approach to the languages. To learning the languages. I remember Christoph Rico talked about before he started doing spoken Greek, he had, he says he had hardly read any Greek, but what he meant by that was the whole New Testament. But he said that it wasn't until he started doing spoken Greek that he actually read just a vast amount of Greek texts outside the New Testament.
I believe he's told me he had read through the New Testament 70 times. So
yeah.
it wasn't compared to most people, he had a lot of, reading experience.
Yeah. But that was something that came up a lot in that series. I remember it with Bethany Case as well. Just when you're able to read fluently, the example you just gave, when you go to those texts that you're not familiar with, you're not restricted to just one sentence. You can read the whole thing in context and get a bigger picture of what's going on. So I bring that up just to say that the way in which you learn Greek and Hebrew can actually set you up better to do lexical semantics. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about that and how we're doing that with Biblingo. We try not to plug Biblingo too much on the podcast, but it's really highly relevant here. So I wanted to ask you, besides, on the one hand, the way we're teaching Greek and Hebrew with Biblingo is for the ultimate goal of developing reading fluency, which again sets you up well for doing lexical semantics. But I think what a lot of people don't know is that we've designed Biblingo in a lot of other ways to help people tune into some of these linguistic features more. So would you share some of those things that we've done with the program?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing, so basically what we have in there is our dictionary, right? So we're building out this dictionary, and it still needs a lot of work and to be built out more. But one of the things, that we're doing is teaching, verbs, for example, with arguments. And so just to explain, I use that term a lot, an argument, and a lot of people scratch their head and look at me funny when I say that, because they don't know what I mean. So just to clarify, what is that? An argument is basically a word that completes the thought of another word, right? So if I say hit, we don't know what hit what, right? And so it takes two arguments. There has to be, something that's hit, and something that hit. So in that case, those two entities complete the thought of the word hit. Now, so that's different than something like an adjunct, right? And an adjunct is not a it's a meaningful component that's added, but it's not necessary, right, to complete the thought of the word. So, you can hit at the park, right? And that's just an adjunct. It just tells you just the location of where that event took place.
So you're saying there a prepositional phrase is an adjunct, not an argument?
Correct. There a prepositional phrase is an adjunct. Now you have prepositional phrases that act as arguments, right? And that's like a prepositional complement is what it would be called. But the point is, on the surface you can't see, you don't really know what whether the word takes an argument, or whether a certain preposition is an argument or an adjunct until you actually do the analysis, right? So for example, verbs of touching, right, in Hebrew, naga, it takes be normally as an argument, or as the thing that introduces the argument, right? So the idea would be that, and this is very normal. In fact, English's direct object is very abnormal. It can take a lot of different kinds of relationships between the verb and the argument, and that's actually quite strange. So you have naga be, and there's really no reason why. So as an English speaker, you would probably expect et, or the direct object, but what you find in the data most often is naga be, and so the question then is, for the learner, right? You have to learn that, and what you have to do is you have to link up, that syntactic construction to a meaning, right? And that's the whole point. And we can get into more of this later when we do some of the examples. One of the other things we do is we try to if sometimes certain verbs take, or certain senses of verbs take certain kinds of arguments, or certain verbs select certain kinds of arguments. So for example, a verb might require an animate argument or an inanimate argument. So you see this in Greek dictionaries, like in BDAG, for example, it'll say T or Tina, right? Where T is inanimate and Tina is animate. So we do this with the second person because second person is always animate, whereas Tina would not always be animate. So if it's a second person argument, then the idea is that that sense requires an animate argument. So it's just if you don't have that second or that animate argument, then you don't have that sense, right? It doesn't mean that the verb necessarily takes that kind of argument, right? But only for that sense. And so that's one of the and that kind of brings me to the last point is linking up senses with syntax, right? And this is again, like we talked about last time, this is a huge area of study that really has not been applied very much within biblical studies, is to say, okay, how can syntax help us to determine the meaning of a word in context? And again, it just, there are syntactic clues. I can think of, there are many in English, for example, the difference between hitting someone and hitting at someone. If you're hitting at someone, you're not necessarily hitting them, right? And we have this, when we hear the difference between those two things, we immediately know, we can see in our mind's eye, right, the actual difference in the world, right? We can say like, oh, the hitting kind of event is different than a hitting at kind of event. But that's the kind of thing that hasn't been done enough in Hebrew or Greek studies to kind of like flesh out how the whole system works together, right? With the prepositions, what do these prepositions mean? How do they interact with the verbs, and how does that create meaning differences when you would use one preposition or the other, or you would use accusative case versus genitive case, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit about how this works practically, like in our dictionary, for example, we'll present verbs with their arguments, but with that, when you're going through lessons or flashcards, for example, learning vocabulary, when you learn a word like naga in Hebrew, to touch, you learn it with the argument. So the actual vocabulary item that you're learning is naga be. And, what that does, I've had people like in the app ask, like, why does it have be? Because before they realize that this is what we do. But so they ask, why does it have be? Like, wouldn't that mean something like touch in, or something like that? And so one, it tunes you into where Hebrew and English are different, and it just wouldn't be right to actually translate the be preposition that way right there.
Right.
But what it does is it alerts them to that up front, so that when they do get into a text and they see naga be something, they're not trying to translate it, with in or something like that. It's just part of the word and its syntax to them. So again, it's developing sensitivities to certain syntactical structures, just from the very beginning, vocabulary acquisition. And then similarly with the sense divisions, again, you're learning different senses of words as different vocabulary items. And so if a word has one sense when it takes an animate object and another sense when it has an inanimate object, you're learning those as two different vocabulary items because they have different senses, different meanings. And so then when you see it again in a text with an animate object, you're not having to like shuffle through maybe different meanings in your head. It's like you've already associated a specific meaning with that word when it takes that argument, because of the way you learned it as vocab. So again, it's just very, very practically developing these sensitivities from day one of learning Greek and Hebrew for you. Now moving toward jumping into some specific examples, but as we're talking about data and how to analyze it, I wanted to talk a little bit about just some problems we run into with word studies, and even objections you hear a lot to actually doing word studies. So, what are some of the issues that we can run into?
I think one of them, and something that I see quite a bit, for some reason, I feel like I see it more within Hebrew than Greek, but it's this idea, really, I think it's a logical error, not so much an error in doing word studies, but it's that potential meaning does not mean the word has a specific meaning in context. So the idea is that, again, if you go to the dictionary and you say, okay, it can mean these three different, it has these three different senses, then how do we decide in a particular context what that word means? And just because it can mean something doesn't mean it means that in this context, right? So, an example of this, kind of like a theologically, difficult example is Walton. John Walton wrote a book on the lost world of the Israelite conquest, right? And he makes it.
Tread lightly. He was a dear professor of mine. So
I'm treading as lightly as I can. He makes this argument about hecherim, where basically the word doesn't mean devote to destruction, like doesn't mean that these people actually died, right? So it is true, right, that I think there are legitimate examples where whenever this action takes place, that people don't die, right? But that doesn't mean that it is true in these contexts or in every context, right? And so then what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, okay, what kinds of contexts would lead to that interpretation? What kinds of contexts would lead to the other interpretation? And then what kinds of contexts do we have here, right? And I mean, personally, I think that the kinds of contexts you have are pretty clear, destruction, right? People die, right? And so, but the lexical point here is that you don't actually get to pick and choose, sort of like what meaning. And I'm not saying that Walton does this so blatantly, but you do have to be careful about when a word can mean something, not to implant that into a specific context, right? It doesn't mean very much to say that it can mean that, right? You're just showing how far the word can go, and then you have to prove that context demands that interpretation.
Yeah. I think that is a really big error that especially students or people who are newer to Greek and Hebrew can make. Again, I mean, I just know as a student, like, that temptation was there, like, kind of have, like, I knew what I wanted the word to mean, and then if I could find that in the lexicon, then I knew I could go with that option, kind of confirmation bias. But yeah, so, even just thinking again about the process, determining lexical meaning, determining contextual meanings, but then with each particular, occurrence of the word, you have to do the work of, determining which contextual meaning is best supported, in that particular text. So,
yeah, for sure.
There's an issue I think we can run into. Something I hear a lot is, saying that, oh, well, this Greek or Hebrew word literally means, insert English word. What is the issue with that kind of talking?
Yeah, so it's it's nonsense is the first issue. So here's the problem, right? Is the Greek word does not literally mean any English word, right? And so that's an arbitrary, or the Hebrew word, right? That's an arbitrary choice that you make to link, that Hebrew word to a particular English word, right? And it's often done on the basis of just incomplete analyses of both Hebrew and English, right? So this actually does require you to know the English word very well, because for example, people do this all the time with, like, fear, right? The fear of God, right? Well, like, you have to really do your homework on what fear means in English, and then what fear means in Hebrew, to determine whether they really are a one-to-one match. And I mean, I'll go ahead and say, like, they're not a one-to-one match, right? There are no English words that match, yare perfectly. And so the problem is, when you say it literally means fear, like, why are you prioritizing or suggesting that this particular English word is a better fit than another particular English word, right? Like, what evidence do we have for that? An example of this that I discovered while doing my dissertation is the word judge. It's pretty fascinating. So if you look at judge, the English word, in the Oxford English Dictionary, they have a sense, I think it's sense like 14 or something, there's a ton of them, where they say it means to rule, but only when translated from the Bible, right? So there are only a few places in the English language where judge means rule, and it's only when it's being translated from another language, right? Which begs the question, okay, maybe judge doesn't mean rule, right? I mean, it doesn't have that sense if a normal English speaker wouldn't use it in that way. And so what that's obviously showing us, right, is that the people have equated shafat, the verb being used here, right, in Hebrew, with judge, and then they have assumed that that's a one-to-one correlation, that shafat literally means judge, and so every time they see shafat, they put it in judge, right? I don't even think that's the best. It's not the best English word for shafat, but you can see the obvious problem, right? When you say it literally means a word, you are prioritizing an English word that doesn't perfectly fit.
Yeah, so a better thing to say would probably be, I think, this English word is probably the closest equivalent to this Hebrew word because X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Because I think
Right.
you talked with, I think it was Will Ross about, the issue of the ambiguity in English glosses. So yeah, you have to be clear about both words. So a couple other big issues that come up. A couple word study fallacies we can run into are the root fallacy and illegitimate totality transfer. And I don't know if we want to spend so much time on these because I think they're actually kind of talked about more than some of the other ones. But one, I feel like we can't talk about word study fallacies without bringing them up. So do you want to maybe just quickly define these for us, and if you have any comments on them?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll let Carson define them. So just from his exegetical fallacies book, and we'll discuss which parts I think are true and which parts need to be revised. So this is what he says about the root fallacy. He says the root fallacy presupposes that every word actually has a meaning bound up with its shape or components. In this view, meaning is determined by etymology, that is, by the root or roots of a word. So I think these are actually two different statements, right? So to say that every word actually has a meaning bound up with its shape or components, I think is actually correct, right? That every word does indeed have a meaning that's bound up with its shape or components. So the only way you can get to the meaning of a word is by looking at its components and how they're put together. That's just how it works. That's all you have. Again, this is not to say that when the example we used with Greek, right, was existemi, and it's not to say that that word must mean stand out, right? Because the Greek word doesn't literally mean stand, right? And or histemi doesn't literally mean stand, and ek doesn't literally mean out, right? And it can when they're combined, we have this special meaning that occurs. But we know that is actually related to the components, right? Like, we can see the connection between standing out and being crazy or amazed or whatever, right?
I think the English example that's given a lot for this is butterfly, right? Like, you can't say that the meaning of butterfly is something like butter, like flying, but and so the fallacy is when you kind of say the entire meaning perhaps is like bound up with the meaning of those two individual words, butter and fly. But it is true that the meaning of butterfly actually is related to those two individual words. I mean, I literally just, like, while you were talking, Googled the etymology of butterfly, and it says it's from Old English, and possibly from an old belief that the insects stole butter. So like it is actually related to those two root words.
Well, and that would be my point, right? Is and this is the second thing that he says. He says, in this view, meaning is determined by etymology, which is a different thing, right? Historically, we can say, right, there was a point in time in which, we can see the components clearly, right? It's not necessarily the case that we can always see those, right? Because words change over time, right? So if a word changes, then we might not be able to, see how it's related to the root. But that doesn't mean that when the words were originally formed by speakers, there was no connection to the root, right? And that's crucial. So and it's true though, right, that he says that meaning is not determined by etymology, right? That's and that here we're looking historically. We can't say that because this word meant something, during Shakespeare's time, that it necessarily means something, the same thing today, right? And in fact, like the whole point of this of etymological sort of reasoning, is that it says like, well, this is like the truer meaning, right? But in actuality, the true meaning is the synchronic meaning for that language community. So how they're using the word now is its meaning. So again, it doesn't mean that we can always look at it, the components of a word, and see that you know, and native speakers can't always detect how those things combine and to form the meaning we have. But it does mean that at some point in the history of the word, that was possible, because those two words wouldn't have been put together in that way if they didn't equal, whatever the output was.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Now, illegitimate totality transfer. Well, I've seen this one actually talked about a lot among people who study Greek and Hebrew. I mean, I feel like it's got to be one of the most committed fallacies. I mean, maybe, from the pulpit, I would say. So, yeah, why don't you define that one for us and talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. So I'll go back to Carson again. It's so he defines it as the supposition that the meaning of a word in a specific context is much broader than the context itself allows and may bring with it the word's entire semantic range. So basically the idea is that, okay, I go to the dictionary and I see, this word, it has 5 different senses. And so then in this particular context, it means all 5 things, right? That's just not how words work, right? Yeah. So an example in English that we talked about yesterday was break up, right? So if you say, she broke up with him after 10 years, right? We know immediately what that means, and we do not in our heads conjure up the meaning of whoever she is pulverizing him into small pieces, right? So if I say I like broke up my son's pill into tiny bits so that he could swallow it, that is, like, again, doesn't conjure up the idea of a girl or a guy cutting off a relationship, right? And so these things, when one sense is activated in our heads, we aren't thinking of the other senses, right? And that's the important point, is that if you look at a dictionary, and part of this depends on how you define senses and how you're parsing out the differences here. But the point is that if there are 2 legitimately separate senses, the word is not going to give you both at the same time. And we really treat them as completely separate things in our heads, even though phonologically they are identical, right? And that's the key, right? Is that they can be identical phonologically, like sound wise, they're the same, but we act like they're completely separate words.
Right. Yeah, I think this is another one that is tempting because of the theological insights that can come from it. If you can kind of fit multiple meanings into a word in any given context, you can kind of say more about what's going on theologically. I have a quote here from Doug Moo, where he said that you should give any word the least amount of meaning necessary to explain it in its context, recognizing that very seldom in ordinary human speech do we intend double meaning when we use a word. And of course, like, you have to be sensitive to, literary genre, like, in poetry, double meaning is perhaps more common. And so this isn't like a hard and fast rule, but I do think it's a good caution that in ordinary, not just human speech, but also in ordinary human, literature, usually we mean one thing, at any given time. So it's a good caution there. Okay. Any other problems or objections to word studies you would like to touch on here?
Yeah, I think one that's I see a lot more, for whatever reason, in studies in the New Testament, but it's the idea that words are entirely context dependent, and I don't really understand where this is coming from philosophically. But here's an example from Kevin Rowe, and he's not the only one that I've seen say this. So I don't want to particularly pick on him. But here's what he says. He says, since words receive their meaning from their larger semantic context, I am somewhat skeptical of the usefulness of precise definitions. They are liable to skew the reading of sentences for the sake of words whose definitions are supposedly separable from the context in which they occur, right? So if you read this as a philosophical statement on how, words make meanings, what you would conclude is that, words don't have meaning apart from the context, which means that they don't have any contribution to the context, and the entire enterprise of trying to figure out a particular meaning, a particular contribution of that morpheme is pointless, right? The problem is that when we have words, outside of context, then we do have an idea of what they mean. We can describe them. The other problem is that words are limited in the kinds of contexts that they appear in, right? We can't put a word in any kind of context. And we should be able to. If they are receiving their meaning only from the context, there's no reason why we couldn't put a particular word in any context and then expect that word to mean whatever the context demands it means, right? But that's not the case. What is the case is that words are constrained, like their meanings constrain the kinds of context that they allow for, right? Which shows that they actually do have a meaning, right? And I used this example yesterday. I can't just say the vase hit. It just doesn't work, right? I can say the vase broke, right? And so that's a difference in meaning that affects the kinds of contexts that we will see those two different words in.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes back to the importance of lexical meaning versus contextual meaning, and understanding that lexical meaning is the meaning that the word contributes to any context. And I think that's key, because it's not to say that like the lexical meaning is like the truer meaning, versus contextual meanings or anything like that. But it's realizing that the reason that particular word was chosen in every place that it in which it was chosen by a native speaker, like there's a reason it was chosen by native speakers across all these contexts, and it's because it contributed something to those contexts. The native speaker thought, what is the best word to use here to communicate what I want to say, and they picked that word because it contributed something, and again, it takes on different meanings and nuances in different contexts, but it does in fact contribute something. And it really, if there is no lexical meaning, I mean, you just can't have it. You would be saying
no meaning.
There's no context, because
exactly.
You're saying that about every word in the context.
Right.
You're starting from,
every single word is dependent upon every single other word, and there's no foundation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But even I think even if you don't kind of affirm that proposition explicitly, that words are entirely context dependent, I think still, and we've talked about this, there's still a tendency to emphasize context over and above lexical meaning or syntax and things like that in biblical studies. And so I think it's a good caution in general. But with that, I think there's one more thing I wanted to talk about here. And it is this like discomfort that people, I think, at least in biblical studies, have with saying that a word does have a core meaning or a lexical meaning, that like an invariable meaning that doesn't change from context to context. What do you think is behind that kind of reluctance to acknowledge that there is such a thing as an invariable meaning for a word?
Yeah, it's interesting because in my own work, I've gotten a lot of pushback on this issue. Whenever I'm introducing, my semantic theory for an analysis I have, I always say, well, I'm assuming that meaning is compositional, and what I mean by that is, that the meaning of a complex expression is determined by the meaning, of the complex expression's parts and how they combine. Right. And that's really foundational to the entire program of semantics. Like I said, with especially formal semantics. So yeah, it is interesting. I think part of the problem is just that people don't read formal semantics. If you're a biblical scholar, like, you're almost certainly going to go to cognitive linguistics first and cognitive semantics, which is fine. But I don't think that they're necessarily in competition. I think they're a lot of times doing something different. But when you don't do that, you don't see this perspective of building meaning in syntax, right? You don't see how I think a great example is with verb frame languages and satellite frame languages that we talked about in the last episode, a little bit with Greek, and then also with Karen, is just when we have seen in the language that you don't have these sorts of constructions like waltz to the house, right? If you don't have that, then we would expect, right, there to be a difference, potentially either in the meaning of the verb in one language or the other, or in the meaning of the preposition, right? Like that's only if though we would only expect that if if meaning is compositional, right? If the reason why in one language we can say it is because the preposition means one thing and it combines with that verb, right? So if the preposition gives you the path, right, in English, then it should be able to combine with things that don't give you a path. If the preposition doesn't give you a path, like in Biblical Hebrew, then in theory it should not be able to combine with verbs that only give a manner, and that's exactly what we see, right? And so the data suggests this, that the fact that you actually have stative uses of all these prepositions in Hebrew, el, mean, the directional hey, right? There are stative uses of that. There are not stative uses of to in English, right? And that suggests a meaning difference, and you can see how that affects the whole system, right? And that is, I think one of the best sorts of arguments for compositionality is just the kind of proof is in the pudding argument, right? We actually do see a difference in how Hebrew and English behave, and we only see that if we assume that meaning is compositional, that the preposition, that the meaning of the whole verb phrase is going to be a combination of the meaning of the verb plus the meaning of the preposition.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's just one of those things that you have to be balanced on, because language is obviously extremely complex. It changes over time. It's flexible in a lot of ways. But like you're talking about, in some ways, language can be kind of, would you say, like mathematical?
There's a reason why, MIT has the best linguistics program in the world, right? There's just, and that's the reason. And there's a reason why there are so many mathematicians working in linguistics, right? And again, this is not to say, right? There are loads and loads of, sorts of like problems that people bring up. Oh, what about idioms? And what about all these other things? Well, these people at MIT are not idiots, right? They've thought of these things, right? And they have intelligent answers for them, right? And there's all kinds of nuances we can bring to the table here. But at the end of the day, we don't want to throw out a theory that works 98% of the time, right? For the 2%, which we might be able to explain in a different way, right? And that's the issue, is that we see compositionality working. We see the cat, meaning cat plus the, right, all the time, right? And so we don't want to just throw out that principle because there are potential counterexamples, right? And this is part of what we're doing in semantics, right? When we see those counterexamples, we want to say, okay, well, what is it about this context that might be leading me to this interpretation that's different, right? And what kinds of hypotheses can I make that would help me to explain the data better, right? While I hold to my principles that again work for me 98% of the time, right? And I say 98% of the time only to say that there are the 2% is often the 2% that I'm not saying is impossible to explain. It's difficult to explain, right? It's not to say that we're just capturing part of the data. But it's the part that we struggle with, right? And that's just part of good theory building in general, honestly.
Yeah, and that it just goes back to the importance of the data and our analyses being driven by the data and constrained by the data. Like, it's fair, to say, like, in a certain sense, like, this must mean this or this can't mean this because of the data. All right, and that is all we have for this bonus episode. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo.